So today we have Johanna ولهارت with us. She is an associate professor in social psychology at Clark University. She got her master at 2004 from University of Cologne, and then she was accepted into the Peace Program, Psychology of Peace Program at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She finished her PhD in 2009, and then she took a little trip to Clark. It was not that far from UMass to Clark, where she is now. Her research focus is on collective victimhood and intergroup relations. She is the founder of Journal of Social and Political Psychology, which is a peer-reviewed open access journal without author fee. That's the important part, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And she is one of the, it wouldn't be any exaggeration if I say that she's one of the leading figures in the field with numerous papers and publications and awards and so on. So I wanted to list, but it would be, I don't know, a long list, and it takes a lot of time to do that. She recently co-edited a book published by Oxford University Press entitled Resistance to Violence and Repression, Global Psychological Perspectives. Having said that, Johanna has been one of the greatest allies of marginalized groups in academia and outside academia. And what I have witnessed is that she has always used his position of power, if she has any, depending on the context, to give platforms to marginalized group in order to their voice to be heard. So I'm very honored, honestly, to have you in the interview. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you for that very generous and slightly exaggerated introduction.
I think there was no exaggeration, but anyway, let's dig in. As we speak, Johanna, we know that there are a conflict going on. We're going to talk about that too, is between Israel and Palestine. So let me take a step back and then ask you about how social psychologists, political psychologists, frame conflicts, in quote, and how this framing, in your opinion, if any, reproduced the damaging discourse that we are witnessing these days. What are the issues in the field?
Yeah, others have written much more about this particular issue. So one paper, I think kind of the central paper on this, is one by Nader Hakim and colleagues, published 2023 in the British Journal of Social Psychology, where they analyze the discourse around research in social psychology on Israel-Palestine. And like in the field more generally, social psychology is a quite depoliticized or apolitical field, I would say. Unlike our colleagues in sociology or political science or anthropology, we tend to use a lot of sanitizing language in many ways, in general, and we tend to not necessarily label and name the political phenomena at play. Instead, we talk about intergroup relations. We talk about, racial biases. We talk about disadvantaged groups, right? Instead of using words like oppression and power and settler colonialism that are quite, widespread and used in other fields, and also by legal scholars. So, this is a general phenomenon in social psychology. It's not just limited to Israel-Palestine, but particularly in the context of Israel-Palestine, accordingly, the language we see used is, as you said, one of conflict, one of intergroup attitudes. Sometimes maybe intractable conflict has actually been used a lot as well, coming from the fields of peace studies and so on. instead of using terms like settler colonialism, right? Instead of talking about the Israeli occupation, instead of talking about genocidal violence. So, okay, so you know, that's the language, but of course, as we know, language matters. So what does it do? It, you know, it again kind of depoliticizes the context. It portrays it as one where both sides, regardless of their actual power or regardless of the actual material violence that is happening, have the same kinds of psychological needs and claims to recognition and identity, you know, kind of justifying, in a sense, those needs on both sides in equal ways, right? Without paying attention to whether or not some of the phenomena might be more appropriate for groups that are experiencing oppression as opposed to groups that are the oppressor, or that we need, or committing violence, or that we need maybe different psychological theories to explain, you know, why an oppressed group talks about their victimhood as opposed to a group committing violence. So those are some of the issues.
Mhm. And in your opinion, how social psychologists, political psychologists, based on your experience, the community reacted to this conflict? I mean, if I want to talk about myself, I kind of have some certain expectations that during any war, not just this war, social and political psychologists take a stand, because they are the ones, at least not the only ones, but they are the ones that know the mechanisms, the psychology of that. They know what sort of mechanisms underpinning all this that has been happening. So I kind of expect that this community should be one of those communities that should react somehow. So how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, one would hope that we use our knowledge to actually, right, do something, move something in the real world. But of course, we're also facing the reality of political pressures and the status quo. And I would say, again, just like I said in response to the previous question, social psychology is actually, despite its roots and despite the topics that we study, overall a pretty conservative field that tends to, you know, work within the system and not challenge it a lot. So I would say social psychology replicated what we saw all the universities do in the so-called Western world, right? After October 7, universities in the US and also in Europe were quick to put out statements condemning Hamas violence and the attacks on Israeli civilians, oftentimes without even mentioning Palestine or Gaza, even though the bombing had already started, right? So this was already like a week in or 2 weeks in, where presumably at that point more, you know, not to fall into the trap of competitive victimhood and so on, but presumably at that point where the statements were coming out, there were already more than 1,000 or you know 1,300 Palestinian victims of the bombings as well. But it was only the Israeli victims of, you know, what was portrayed as a terrorist attack that were given any kind of recognition, right? And social psychology, at least in the Western world, I don't know what Asian and Middle Eastern associations of social psychology or Latin American societies did, but, you know, I know the statements that came from SPSP, the American Society, or EASP, the European Society, and they basically replicated these patterns from the universities and from the governments of Western European and countries in the US. Again, kind of emphasizing Israel and Israeli deaths, oftentimes not mentioning Palestine or Gaza, sometimes yes, but definitely never mentioning, you know, the context of settler colonialism, all the previous bombings of Gaza that had led up, the siege on Gaza, right, that had led up to it. And, you know, interestingly, for a field that is all about trying to understand the individual in its social context, there was a huge outcry among many social psychologists when other social psychologists tried to point out we need to add that context. You cannot just talk about October 7th and the violent attacks that occurred then, without talking about the historical and socio-political context, which should be simply, right, as scientists, as academics, I mean, these are just objective facts, but they have been so politicized, they have been so, you know, talking about context was portrayed as if we are exonerating. It was oftentimes discussed by social psychologists, right, as exonerating the violence and as somehow glorifying the violence, legitimizing it. So there's a huge disconnect between what our field is actually meant to do and says it does, and how many social psychologists, not all, obviously, there have been letters and movements against that, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that should be mentioned as well, both to SPSP and to EASP. There were groups of scholars, oftentimes led by PhD students, actually, and not by, you know, the full professors of our field, urging us to consider the context, to name Palestine, to name settler colonialism, etc. But it's a contentious issue in our field, even though it shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's
because
right.
it's moralized. It's portrayed as a moral issue as opposed to simply describing facts, right?
That's right. That's right. But Johanna, what baffles me and what I've been thinking about is that we we are talking about ourselves, right? We are talking about our community and different sections, different tendencies, I don't know, within the community. So I say we. So we tend to see ourselves as progressive, right, in academia. So, and you mentioned in your response that we live in a very conservative community as social psychology. So, how social psychologists, political psychologists reconcile that? At the same time, we see ourselves as progressive, that we are working towards social justice, equality, equity, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we have these conservative tendencies, especially when it comes to action. It seems to me that there is this tendency, it's not about our field, I think, to be honest, in academia, that we tend to intellectualize the stuff. And when we want to see if there is any action, you see the conservativeness more specifically there. What's your opinion on that?
You mean the backlash against activism, or
The backlash against the activism or the inaction within the academia, even though that a lot of us believe that, and when I say us, I mean the community,
right?
believe that, oh, we are progressive, so we are supposed to take action. It's simple. So why this contradiction?
Well, there are a few, I think, factors at play. So one is, I do think within psychology, compared to other social sciences like sociology or anthropology, there is a stronger tendency, as you know, right, towards positivism, towards aiming to reproduce natural science, you know, standards, criteria, right? There is a lot of discourse still, despite now the increasing influence of social constructivism and so on our field. But overall, as you know, the majority, the mainstream, still pretty much models itself after natural sciences, which comes along with the claim of objectivity, which of course is nonsense, because right, whatever we study will always be informed by our political conditions and interests, right? But some topics are seen as political and others are just accepted as, or seen as neutral because they're part of the status quo, right? So I think that's part of it, this kind of, and you know, like we as, right, like the both of us, we are in this bubble of people who belong to SPICY or ISPP and kind of, you know, are and use more qualitative, more critical methods, more social constructivist views, right? So we don't share that. But if we look at the field as a whole, there's a very strong tendency to push towards allegedly objective social psychological science, right? And of course, all of that is political as well, which topics are seen as value neutral and which topics, and you know, because they reproduce the power structures and the topics that are seen as valid, and then which are seen as political because they counter the power structures and the current status quo.
That's
So
right.
that's part of it. I was going to say something else, but I forgot.
Okay. Let me know if it comes to you later. So, and give me a little bit of your experience, if you would like. It's up to
Oh,
you.
sorry. I just
Go.
remembered.
Yeah.
Apologies. I just remembered what I wanted to add. So I
Go.
think it's also important to look at, though, the shifting norms around this and which topics become kind of sanctioned by society and then therefore by the field to be studied as objective, even though they're actually political, right? So a few examples are simply, it may have been controversial in the beginning to study racial resentment, racial attitudes, racial bias, right? Like back in the day, but that has become acceptable. And similarly in 2020, right, or before 2020 already a little bit, but mostly 2020 in the US, even corporations like Nike or whatever started posting Black Lives Matter signs. So society accepted, like, okay, this is now a topic that we can actually talk about. And social psychologists jumped on the bandwagon as well. And we saw then many special issues around racism and so on, which, 10, 20 years before, maybe even 5 years before, would have been seen as not objective and problematic and political. And that is not to say that there hasn't been backlash against that, because there has also been very powerful backlash. But, the mainstream of our field, kind of step in step with society in general, has now accepted, okay, that's a topic we can talk about and research within what we see as objective science, more or less. And so that hasn't yet happened with Israel and Palestine. That hasn't yet happened, right, with several other issues. But we see normative shifts over time.
Mm-hmm. And again, you are one of the senior social psychologists, and not necessarily
Not yet as
age-wise,
senior.
not age-wise. I mean, in terms of one of the big names, at least in the field. If you
Sure
look
about
back
that.
at
Okay.
the history of social and political psychology, do you see uh, what's the trajectory here? Do you how do you evaluate this trajectory? So you mentioned that we always like to see ourselves as part of natural sciences, right? We want to be objective, value-free, neutral, and so on and so forth. So if you look at that and different incidents, like for example, civil rights movement, women's movement, and so on and so forth, they have some impacts on the field, right? So I'm going to ask you, what's the trajectory here? Do you have, I don't want to say do you have any hopes, but do you think you're witnessing enough change in the field, or you expect more, or you think we need to push more? The majority is still not getting it. And what's your opinion on this?
With regard specifically to Israel-Palestine, or in general, the change, Israel-Palestine?
Palestine.
Yeah, I'm somewhat always torn between cynicism or pessimism or realism, as I would perhaps call it, and optimism.
Optimism.
So, I'm somewhere in between. So,
Nice.
my cynicism / realism would say a lot of this is simply shaped by geopolitics and by power, right? So, to just give another example of topics that became okay to study and part of the mainstream, after 9/11, the fringe topic of terrorism became very popular in the US, right? Like previously it was ignored or on the margins and just studied by a few marginal characters because it wasn't something that Americans were as concerned with in their turf. But once it became relevant to them, right, it became a big research topic in our field, along with funding from the Department of Defense and other types of military sources of funding, centers were created, right, based on that larger funding. So that's kind of my pessimism, that as long as geopolitics kind of dictates right, that we need to throw ourselves behind US military support for Israel, we won't see much change in our field, because I do see a very strong influence of geopolitics on our field and you know, societal norms on our field. On the other hand, kind of from below, we're seeing a huge normative shift right now, right? I mean, so many people have been talking about this, that we've never seen so much
That's right.
popular support for Palestine. And you also see now faculty slowly becoming outspoken. I mean, now there was the first faculty encampment in the US, started yesterday at the new school, which was, you know, completely unthinkable just a few weeks ago, maybe. Faculty getting arrested to protect their students who are protesting against genocidal violence in Palestine. So norms are shifting, right? And when we look at these signature lists that are going around, they're growing, right? More and more people whom I didn't expect to sign are signing some of those letters, not all. There's definitely normative shift, also with regard to the language that is being used. And I think part of it can also be explained with, you know, you mentioned the book that I co-edited on the psychology of repression and resistance. And one important lesson from that work is that repression will often backlash, as in it will not be effective. It will oftentimes create more and more moral outrage, right? And kind of move people who weren't as politicized in the beginning, but become politicized by seeing this kind of overreaction of the state, overreaction of you know, any kind of repressive bodies, where even apolitical people start saying like, wait a minute, that's not right. And then almost, you know, as you know, as reactants, as a reaction to that, then, you know, join that movement, or at least become more supportive. So I think that's actually playing a role as well, that the repression of Israel-Palestine discourse and activism and solidarity has just become so ridiculous, right? That many people are slowly responding to that and becoming more supportive in response. So I'm hopeful that those normative shifts, right, will do enough, or at least will do, you know, something to counter the very real influence of
That's right.
politics and power
Yeah,
from
yeah,
above.
that's right. Yeah, there is
There are two
definitely
forces.
a shift in social norms from below. Yeah, it's visible, completely visible. And I think that's the part that the hope comes in, that you can see that a lot of
Exactly.
students, scholars slowly starts to protest and see that they need to change different discourses to describe the situation and take action and so on and so forth. That's right.
Exactly.
So what I have been always interested in when it comes to resistance is it might be a little bit personal, so feel free to shut me down.
No.
Where do you get the energy, Johanna?
What
So no,
energy?
it's a serious question, honestly, because you do your academic work. And again, I don't want to make it a personal or individual issue. I think it's a general, it can be a general strategy. Where, when I say, when I ask, where do you get the energy? There is this sense of, I don't know, camaraderie, that the energy should come from some social relations, I don't know, communities and stuff like that. In my experience, based on my observation, it's hard to get that from academia. That's my uh, experience. Uh, can you tell us a little bit about that?
So where do I get the energy to do what exactly?
To
To care
to
about
do
these issues, to work on these
yeah,
issues?
because yeah, you're active, right? You're active in terms of in academia. The book is an example. You try to not only take action in the streets or wherever you think it's necessary, be out there for the cause. You not only do that, but also you try to translate that action into the academic literature, right?
Mhm.
And energy, it needs time, especially the energy, the psychological impact of being exposed to, because as you said, you get a lot of backlash, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, the bigger name you are, the bigger the backlash. If I do something, I'm not a big name. Yes, those people who are around me and disagree with me might do something. Uh, but again, the bigger the name, the bigger the backlash, generally speaking. So, where do you get that energy? What do you do to move forward and continue the resistance?
Mm. Yeah, I actually have not gotten much backlash yet, I will say. I mean,
Oh, wow.
some trolling on Twitter, but nothing serious that affects my, academic, my job, my paycheck, knock on wood, right? So far, so good. Probably multiple layers that protect me. Being in the US, being a white Jewish woman, right? It's probably protecting me, although we're not immune from that either, because now they don't hesitate to portray Jews as anti-Semitic either.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all just to say I'm actually not dealing with personal repression myself. Maybe some people who unfriended me on Facebook or, wrote nasty comments on my Twitter or whatever, right? So there's social ostracism pressure, which is never pleasant, but, nothing material. Yeah, energy. I mean, I think, as you said in the beginning, if we study these topics, I feel a certain responsibility, right? Studying these topics. I cannot divorce them from actual political action or their implications and meaning. In my view, if I study, I study the psychology of various oppressed groups historically or in the present, how people make sense of their group's victimization, how they respond in different ways. In my view, that gives me also an obligation to actually act upon that knowledge, right? And to also act consistently. So if I'm studying solidarity as a researcher, if I'm making my academic living by writing about solidarity and oppression and so on, I cannot just be an academic grifter and then, not say anything or do anything when these issues are being lived out so clearly on the streets or in the world. So that for me is really important. It's a matter of like personal integrity. It's a matter of, acting in line with your values and showing a certain sense of responsibility to act upon the knowledge that we have, right? So that's an important part of it for me.
Okay.
The other part is that luckily through my, whether it's my personality and personal interests or just coincidence and life circumstances, family, right? But I have a fairly international network of people that I interact with. I mean, this already starts with my family migrating to different places throughout history for similar, for related reasons. But also my friends, my colleagues, the people I work with, right? People who are drawn to work on these topics. When you look at the table of content, right, of the book, I mean, you're in it, you have a chapter there. We have authors from Lebanon, from the West Bank, from the Philippines, from from Sudan, right? So when you work with all these colleagues and friends on these topics and discuss them, you're also just exposed to so many different perspectives outside of the US mainstream, white middle class professional bubble, which also makes it impossible for me to take, certain positions that are normative here and ignore everything that I'm hearing from people I know. So that's another part of it, just kind of the exposure to those networks and people's lived experiences within them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned that you are a white Jewish person. So
Mhm.
I'm wondering, with all these things happening, I just want to get your take on Jewish identity.
Mm.
How do you think all these incidents have impact of uh, what we call Jewish identity? Is there any change? Is it going to be that we will witness a more politicized people within the Jewish community, or
Mhm.
is there any shift? Because one of the things that I've that I have in my mind is that education has been one of the most important thing as part of the Jewish identity. Uh, uh, do you think how this war plays out in relation to Jewish identity?
Oh yeah, it's huge. I mean, right now it's like showdown, right? For Jewish identity. It's so contested. It is so, you know, just central to also Jewish reactions to what happened October 7th and in the aftermath right now. A lot is changing. A lot is being just kind of, you know, materialized in more drastic ways that was already present. You know, generally we see there's a huge battle, right, between different types of Jewish identity that have a lot to do with how people make sense of our own historical history of oppression and victimization, right? And this is the stuff I work on and, you know, draw also on work from other colleagues in the field, like Yechiel Klar, who unfortunately is no longer with us, who wrote about the different lessons that Jews draw from the Holocaust. And, you know, they're similar to the lessons we see in general in society, never again for anyone or never again for Jews. And that leads to very distinct reactions, right? And support for different types of policies. So that's part of it. And then obviously attitudes towards Zionism that's linked, and Israel that's linked, not, you know, completely overlapping, but it's also, of course, related to the lessons we draw from historical victimization. Like, should we be defending ourselves in Israel and upholding the, you know, the state as a lesson of the Holocaust, or should we be doing exactly the opposite, right? That's all related. It's also important to remember that, you know, it's historically rooted. There have always been anti-Zionist Jews as long as Zionism existed. And there was a very rich history of that. For example, one of my favorite talking points, you know, the Bundists are a socialist labor movement in Eastern Europe before the war, that started before the war. And that insisted that, you know, rather than trying to migrate to Israel, we need to build socially just communities and participate in local struggles of justice where we are now. There's this concept of Dakeit, like here-ness, right? So there's, and then of course there were also many Zionist Jews, right? So it has always been part of Jewish identity and Jewish culture. Then kind of through, again, geopolitics and a lot of other assimilationist, you know, processes and whatever, it became kind of mainstreamed into Jewish identity to be Zionist and in support of Israel. That became a huge part of Jewish identity. But now it's really kind of, again, you know, breaking apart and being polarized much more. But it is a really contested issue, right? Because you have people, instead of, and one problem is that instead of just accepting the fact that Jewish identity is pluralistic and people have different ways of understanding this and viewing this and relating to our past in Israel and so on, you see instead this kind of battle over what is the right way to be Jewish, what is the right Jewish identity. And, you know, the Jewish left and anti-Zionist Jews are as guilty of that as Zionist Jews, because when you read kind of the arguments, and I've probably done that myself, right? Like we really keep insisting, like, no, these are the lessons of the Holocaust. It means never again for anyone, and therefore this and this and that. And we're oftentimes not good at, as a collective, right? Like just acknowledging, like, look, people have many different ways of relating to all these topics. There are different ways of being Jewish, in part because so much is at stake, right? We are talking about implications for violence, for genocidal violence, and our complicity in it, you know, accusations based on it, right? So it's become very heated and contested.
That's right. That's right. I think we need to wait and see how this war affects not just Jewish communities, but also Muslim communities, even the politics in the United States, in the regions, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you're right. If I haven't asked any important questions that you think I should have asked, uh, take your time if you want to add more. But before that, I just want to, again, thank you to be there for all those marginalized all those groups that have been oppressed in many different ways. And I think one of the things that I always admire in people is what you just mentioned, that there is not just talk, it's also the walk. And you are one of the people that, at least to my knowledge, you did your best to walk the talk. And I think that's very, very important in our field, which is, as we said, is a very conservative community. So again, thank you for being there. And yeah, it's the floor is yours if you want to add something at the end.
No, I mean, there's, one could fill hours discussing these issues, but I think we covered you asked a lot of the central questions. So
good.
Thank you for creating space to discuss it.
Sure, let me